So, hi, this is Making Digital Citizenship Learning Inclusive. My name is Carrie Rogers-Whitehead. I'm the founder of Digital Respons-Ability, and I am the first to say this is something I'm learning a lot more about because this is when we've taught a lot of digital citizenship, it's very much one size fits all. Sometimes the focus is just on online safety, and it's not always adaptive to everyone in the audience. And also on a policy level, which we will be discussing about policy as well, there is kind of a lack of people that should be involved in that policy making, that should have a say in that policy making that can affect inclusivity. So we're going to talk about inclusivity, not just from the classroom and teaching curriculum side of things, but we'll be talking about policy from a leadership and on a broader scale as well. So welcome, there's a chat box in there. I'll be monitoring that as we go through. You'll get a certificate and the recording and link when you're done. It looks here on our poll, we have some teacher administrators and we have some others. So feel free to share your background there too. So my background's in public libraries, which I started kind of working in this area of inclusivity because public libraries are just a space for everybody, which I love, but also like I probably could have had a better, it would have been better for me to get a master's in social work a lot of time as a public librarian because there was just so many people and abilities and different backgrounds all in one place that you navigated as much as a public librarian. So that's a little bit about my background. But I'd love to hear about you. I wrote a chapter in my latest book with ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education, on inclusivity and learning. So I hope to expand on that. Initially, when I pitched this book, the entire book was around inclusivity, but then we tailored it a little bit more to a school leadership audience. So you'll find some details from my co-author in this presentation, Dr. Vanessa Monterosa, who was the architect behind a lot of the scaling and policy making at Los Angeles School District. So I'll be sharing a little bit of what she wrote in the book and my own experiences around policy and school administration as well, because a lot of, there's stuff that filters from the bottom to the top, but let's be honest, the culture and a lot of that inclusivity is set at the top and goes down to the bottom as well. So, that book's out now. There's an entire chapter that dives in even deeper on this topic of inclusivity that I'll be sharing as well. And the website, if you look in there, I'll put a just real quick in the chat box. Feel free to introduce yourself as well as we go through. Oh my gosh, it's like when I know someone's watching me. But I mess up my typing, but deepingdigitalcitizenship.org. There's some resources. There's like needs assessments, lesson plan templates, and there's other free stuff on that website to attach to the book. But I'll start off with policy and leadership. I'm going to go broad and then I'll go narrow as we go through this presentation. And I welcome your thoughts as well. So this last, it was a year ago, I was asked by someone with the Utah State Board of Education, we work closely a lot in Utah, to start creating a draft of what would a framework look like for digital citizenship statewide. So I'll share a little bit of that experience, and this is part of that draft version that is shared publicly. It's on the Utah State Legislature's site, although we've had a few minor revisions since this, as well as adding more on AI because a lot of people are working on policy and AI as well. So when we're talking about inclusivity, a lot of this needs to be put in that language at the top here. So when this involved, I wrote some drafts, but I wrote it with other people and we had some focus groups and we brought community members in there to kind of get an idea of what this framework would be, because you want to have some shared values and shared definitions. I don't know if it's happened to you, but I've been in many different meetings where we spent the whole time arguing about definitions and you didn't go anywhere because there wasn't these things that were shared that could start at the top. So in the framework, also like how we work on school culture around this, it starts broader and it goes more specific. So this is part of the first page of the framework. And at the end, it goes into like specific responsibilities. Like this is the LEA responsibilities. This is what parent and communities do. But we started with a kind of a quote and we started with the why. We started with like, why are we here? And then we moved on to definitions. Like these are where these definitions came for. This is what we agree on. And so if you're working in this area of inclusivity, first of all, include the people as you're working on some of this policy piece, have it go through many different drafts. We had this living on Google Docs for a while with people making comments, looking through it to kind of have some of these shared definitions out there. But also like how you write it. If we, using definitions that are more common, trying to make it simple. So much of this gets legalese as well. But one thing that we wrote on here, and you can see under the why, is without a coordinated and comprehensive framework, activities in this area will be disjointed, fragmented, and siloed. And that's sometimes what happens with like our special educators or our kids who maybe are not in traditional schools. They're siloed and they're kind of away from some of those things. So a framework can help build and bring these people together because there's multiple agencies in different areas of responsibility that are working in the area of the framework. Feel free to email me at the end. If you want a copy of the draft, I can direct you on where to go if you're looking at this yourself. It's like some ideas of what that looks like. So having a framework, having these shared values, these are some of the shared values that we include. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer, but this went through a lot of wordsmithing and some people there too. And we really tried to keep it positive and collaborative and communicative of the power and the potential of the internet instead of just focusing on sometimes the safety piece. We also wrote in there, involve the broader community and discussions, because if you don't have parents in the community on this area, it's not going to be reinforced at home. And then we specifically called out that safety is just one piece of digital citizenship. So these were some of our, principles. You can also use the word values, however you want to call it. But as you create that why, you start with those definitions, you move to those values, it kind of helps bring people together, because maybe some other people might not agree, but they can probably find some values that they like that speak to them a little bit more, and they can see where this happens. We also kind of wrote in here specific questions. What is our response? And talking about those responsibilities as well. So making inclusive, shared values, shared definitions, starting with the why. And other kind of tips as we go through is, one thing, this is something I said in the book. I got a copy right here. I said this in the book a few times. If it's everybody's responsibility, it's no one's authority. And things get lost when okay, digital citizenship is important. Great. Well, who is accountable? Who evaluates this? Where's the authority? Where's the budget? Who has the time in the day? So it's not enough to just make a broad statement that this is everybody's responsibility. Oh, you should, and you can see it from that draft of the framework that it's there, but like very specific of like who has authority, because authority is different than responsibility. Maybe you're in one of those roles. This was me when I was a public librarian. I had all the responsibility and none of the authority. They're like, do these projects, but you don't have a budget. I need you to get this team that does this, but you have to go through their bosses to get permission to do that. So it was a struggle for me to kind of be in that position as like a coordinator on the system level when I didn't have the authority, but I had the responsibility. So if you're in that position and maybe you have, and you're beg, borrowing, and stealing, you're like politicking, you're relationship building, but you can't force anyone to do anything. And you can get stuff done. I'm not saying that that's not important to do, but if you don't assign the specific authority, things sometimes fall to the wayside. And this is what often happens in the area of digital citizenship and online safety. In my experience working with schools, is that no one is assigned to it. It is just something that everyone says is important, but there's no budget or there's no accountability of what that actually looks like. Who is reporting to who, or how do we share this out, or any of it? It's just like, yeah, this is important. And then it kind of dies in the meaning of it there too. On that framework as well, we mentioned federal and state districts, laws, and policies as well. And some, you can't always change the legalese. You're not in control of that. So you can have the best written stuff about values and principles, but a lawyer might come and do that as well. So you have to think on digital citizenship. There's the values, there's the principles, there's the definitions, but there's also the law. And so integrating that can be a little bit tricky too. But you'll want to kind of at least reference that. That helps a bit with that issue of authority versus responsibility if there is a law or something backing it up. I wish people would be like, yeah, I'll just do that out of my own free will and time and all the budget I have. But that's just not how life works. Sometimes we need a little we need the carrot and the stick, a little extra nudge there too. Other policy talk about making it inclusive, and this is from my co-author, Dr. Monterosa, from her experience working with Los Angeles United School District. There is one thing that she did is translated across different languages, what cover different parts of the district, but like they recognize it's not one size fits all, and it's just, and digital citizenship shouldn't be one size fits all, and we're going to be talking about ways to adapt and differentiate that later. But you do your best with policy. You're probably going to miss it if you get in a room with a bunch of librarians like I have, which librarians love our wordsmithing and our categories. They will chop it up. They will destroy it a little bit, and they'll go through and they'll wordsmith it. But at the end of the day, the process is part of the process is brings the community together. So for example, when I ran a focus group around that framework, we didn't necessarily make a lot of changes to the framework from the feedback, but the fact that they were listened to and they felt included helped the process. Just sometimes people just want to share their thoughts, and they want to be asked and they want to be considered. So the process is not just the final product of the draft, but it's about the conversations that you have as you go through it. So when addressing these on a system level piece, we talk about this in the book of how people look at things, and we all kind of come in on with our own different backgrounds. So I'm on a commission right now working in this area of policy, and you've got the educator side, you've got the administrator side, you've got the law enforcement side, you've got a few different pieces, and they're looking at it differently. So I'll work closely sometimes with law enforcement, and they look at it from a safety aspect. Of course, right? That's their background. That's what they come from. The teachers are often like, raw curriculum, let's digital learning. This is exciting. And the administrators are like, let's make sure we're following the board rules. So you've got these different perspectives or these different frames that we address in the book that we look at. So 4 different frames. This is from the 4-frame model if you ever want to dive into it. But it's a way of thinking how people are approaching the issue, and it creates a little bit more empathy, because sometimes it is hard to be in those meetings and there's the person who's like, well, that didn't work, or let me share your thing. But it's not like they're bashing on it. They are just have a different perspective and different experiences. From the law enforcement side, they're going to look at this very differently. So for example, I work with the Internet Crimes Against Children's Task Force. They see the worst of the worst. They're seeing the trafficking and they're seeing the worst of the internet. That is their job, to see the worst of the internet. So if they go in on a discussion, they're going to go in a kind of a negative way. And wouldn't that color your opinion of the internet after a while? So people come in with those perceptions and opinions, and kind of looking at it, those different frameworks help. So one thing that we talk about in the book is that symbolic frame, is that can be a way to kind of unify things together: culture, values, symbols, traditions. Well, I might not necessarily agree on how you were actually implementing this, but maybe we can agree on this kind of cultural symbolic piece. That symbolic frame is something that can help get around those different perspectives. So if you're talking more about the symbolic frame, is about a ritual. So this is a great way to fit in digital citizenship and kind of to fit it in places maybe where it should be but hasn't. You have different school events, you have different holidays, you have different things you celebrate, and you incorporate it in there. It's that emphasis on values. So having that framework with values in helps and reinforce that symbolic frame. Political frame is often where the administrators come from. And they are looking at, okay, do we have the staff to do this? They're the ones that help with that issue of authority versus responsibility. They're seeing what's the budget, what's the staff, what do we need to pull from here? So you need both of them, because symbolic frame can just not necessarily can ignore the realities of the situation. I remember, I'd have policies that were created when I was a librarian. I was like, you are not on the ground. You do not know what this looks like. You want to come to my library one day and then tell me to do this, because that's not the reality of how this works. And I know that sounds a little snarky, but there's some times that it can create resentment, because if you're just focusing on the pie in the sky thing and ignoring the realities of the day-to-day work of running an organization, a school, a library, wherever it is, that's why these two frames are kind of often butt heads, but they're kind of important that they work together. So working on that system level inclusivity, having both sides, the political frame to organize it and look at the resources and allocate the resources, but the symbolic frame to create those shared values that keep people cohesive together and really kind of lift the conversation. Those really, they go a lot well. So also on the systems report, I mentioned that shared vision. This is from Dr. Monterosa as well, the shared values. When she refers to artifacts here, what's an example of that? Sometimes things like, a contest or an initiative or some ritual can really help bring people together to reinforce those symbols piece there. But, this is that top-down approach, as I'm mentioning, and that we need to look at. And also, sometimes this is hard. There's a lot of territories. There's a lot of strong feelings. I've been in meetings with tears with people who have very strong emotions. I've taught parents who've walked out because they weren't they had strong emotions around like social media and the internet. And it is difficult sometimes to have those conversations. So I try to look at these in this framework of where are they coming from, where are they operating out of, to really try to make that inclusivity approach. It's hard. A lot of people involved in this. Feel free to share, like, who am I missing? I mean, and who am I missing among this group here? Is who do we partner with? I mentioned these a little bit. Sometimes our special education leads aren't included. Our operations people, we need the political framework to look at who do we have, who can be allocated, what does this look like? Media specialists, of course, they're often the ones with the standards around digital citizenship. But I found that when we go into schools, we're often invited by the health educators, by someone who does, health weeks or some kind of event around that. And and if you look at a lot of standards on a state level, you'll see health education that's fit under there too, but they're not necessarily always included in these conversations as well, especially school counselors who are some special ed school counselors, sometimes even media specialists are a little bit pushed to the side on this. So making sure that we're creating that inclusive policy around anyone else. And if there's someone there that these are just some examples, but who else is missing? Who else should be here to partner on that? Now, policy is great, and we need that to guide us, to kind of set the culture, set the tone, set the values. But if it's not implemented well, there's only so much. Maybe you are aware of your organization having a graveyard of policies. I know. I've been in that situation where I've learned about policies that were buried in some handbook on some server that nobody knew about. Like there's a graveyard of policies that are never updated or referenced or anything. So it doesn't do anything good to have any kind of policies without any action behind it, or if people aren't aware of it. I learned about one policy in our library that was like 8 years old after I started, that was never introduced to me after I broke that policy. So how we expect people to know them, they might even break it if they aren't aware that it exists. So policies are important, but practice and how this actually works is a whole other beast. And feel free to share any stories you've had. I've got a few of like, that doesn't work in practice here too. And I'll share some anecdotes. So this is a bit from the book, but it's also, I did an ISTE expert webinar that if you are a member of ISTE, you can access. I'm going to share some specific examples of different populations and how digital citizenship was taught and presented, and some tips. Feel free to share your input as well. So youth in custody, I've worked with youth in custody for many years. I started when I was a librarian running book clubs out of multiple detention centers, and then continued that work after I left the library. I'm currently on a prison education faculty. I teach at the Utah State Prison. So I continue to work with students in custody. If any of you are in higher ed, you're going to see a lot more students in prisons, because now they can get Pell Grants. So there's been a really increased number of them. But teaching youth, if we're talking youth specifically, although I have taught this to adults in custody as well, presents its own challenges. So on 3 different occasions, I have taught classes. I just did this last semester out of chapels because they didn't have space for me or a traditional classroom setup or whatever it is. So I sometimes have to wheel in a whiteboard, or I'd use smaller little whiteboards, and I wouldn't have much supplies at all. So first of all, like, and this is how digital citizenship is sometimes taught. Maybe you're in a temporary building, maybe you just don't have those supplies or whatever it is. And how do you adapt? How do you adapt to that? So often a bunch of different grade levels and ability in one group. It's a smaller group, but you got a wide range of that. So this is from some classes in 2021. We found some great increase in their feelings on safety. They are also, I was quite impressed. They often, youth in custody are they're in therapy and they're other kind of group settings. So they are working a lot on their emotions and behaviors. So they were pretty up with like how they were feeling and how technology made them feel. We had a lot of discussions about that, but we were happy to see some pre and post survey changes from that as well. But it has its challenges. So this last summer, I was teaching for 2 weeks, a bunch of youth in custody, and let's just say the HVAC system was not working well in July. So it has its challenges there too. But I should circle back to a few things that I emphasize with this group. I emphasize issues of safety, of course, but we also spent some extra time on communications and etiquette. Reading levels are often lower with youth in custody, and that can translate to their communications online as well. So that's something. Also, we emphasize digital health and wellness, like sleep. Sleep is a big issue for all teens, but especially this group, and we emphasize, communication and media literacy. Refugees and immigrants, I've worked with a few different centers out there. You also have a often similar situation where you have a variety of different backgrounds and abilities all in one room. Now, I went in this thinking that there would be more digital inclusion issues, and there are, but the digital inclusion issues aren't that they don't have the internet. It's not even that always necessarily they don't have broadband internet, but they don't have like laptops and desktops. They're very much mobile connected. You also have, with digital inclusion issues, multiple families sharing different devices as well. So navigating that. So when we talked with parents and worked with them, we talked specifically about how do we set up other user profiles, and how do we talk, and the little kids, we talked about how do we ask permission to use devices, because if you've got a whole family, maybe sharing one laptop or multiple kids sharing one phone, sometimes the little kid finds something the brother or sister was looking at that was inappropriate. So having logins and user profiles and things like that is something that we talked about. Now, I have taught with parents from a variety of different classrooms, and it is interesting when I talk to parents who are refugees that I don't see as much negativity. This is my own personal experience. Your experience might be different, but my experience is that they really welcome the phone because it kept them in touch with people from far away. We have a lot of from the Congo in our community in Salt Lake, and a lot of them were in Kenyan refugee camps, and they had phones there, and they still had family and friends in the camps, and they were able to keep in touch with those phones, and that was a really big deal from them. Sometimes when I go to more well-off schools, sometimes I get a little more of the negativity. One way to know if a parent's usually going to complain about technology is if they work in tech. So sometimes those schools have these different perceptions. But if we go in there making assumptions that tech is negative and have this negative slant, that's really maybe not how a lot of our audience might feel. I heard from a lot of parents how grateful they were for the technology and able to keep in touch with people. So this past summer, along with working 2 weeks with sweaty adolescents with broken HVAC system in detention, I had the chance to go to Vietnam and actually train some of their teachers and met with some of their Ministry of Education. So Vietnam, as well, a lot of Southeast Asia is digitizing rapidly. More and more, they're becoming more and more connected, and they are working on building up digital skills in their workforce. So I presented on digital citizenship to the Ministry of Education out there, and it was interesting hearing their perspectives too. So they were really watching what was happening out there because this was happening fast. So yes, we have a lot. We got some problems with the tech industry and social media. I'm not dismissing that, but we've had like a period of time to kind of adjust to those problems and those changes. I guess it's been around a bit, but for countries that digitize quickly, this is all happening very fast. Malaysia specifically, one of the fastest growing adoptions of smartphones in the world. So if you are in a situation in some of these other cultures that they are getting it very quickly, they maybe not have, the kids have had no education on digital citizenship because and they haven't created some of the infrastructure and the education, the curriculum behind it. So thinking about other cultures, we kind of look, from an American centric lens, we're like, oh, that's old news. Well, maybe to us, but not to everyone else, especially, with issues of broadband and infrastructure that's growing. So they spent a lot of time on infrastructure and it's been fast. Can you imagine just maybe like, you connecting to social media 5 years ago? Like some of this is just a few years ago that they're getting certain apps and it's happened fast. So it was interesting hearing what they thought. They're very concerned about digital skills and education, and they want more of this. They can see the negative, but they can also see the positive. But this is something that they're as soon as the infrastructure is built, it happens quick, and they have a lot of generational divide on this as well. So I talked about, a little bit of cultural. Let's talk about age, and then let's talk about abilities. This is an issue in digital citizenship in the online safety world. It's something that we've been getting more and more requests from, is content for kindergarten through second and pre-K as well, because you have kindergartners with their own phone. And I didn't believe it as well, but when my son was in kindergarten, he was telling me about that. I'm like, no, are you sure? And he's like, yes. And then I saw it in my own eyes. I tell you, I would not have believed it. But yeah, and I can understand that some situations they would. Maybe you have multiple parent families, you have other circumstances, but younger and younger ages, they're getting their first device. But where do we do a lot of digital citizenship education? Middle school. Middle school is often where it starts. So you have maybe the kids getting something at age 13. And at that point, well, they've been around technology for their whole life. Our alphas, I guess, the one before the Gen Z, they've been on the internet since they were like, their ultrasound pictures were on the internet. They've never known a time without social media and internet. Gen Z can maybe remember somewhat of a time without certain apps and social media. Alphas, no, it's always been there. But we are still we're kind of educating our generation alphas like we are our Gen Zs and our millennials, thinking a little bit later. So I really like, and you can see ISTE's age banding standards of age 4 through 7. But I mean, our early childhood caregivers are not necessarily being included in these conversations. That goes to that inclusivity on policymakers, but they're being exposed. They're maybe through a sibling, through things online. They are getting this information like almost too late. And when I would talk to adolescents sometimes about this, sometimes I get their eyes rolled. They're like, duh, we've been doing this for years. Why are, we're a little bit late to the game. And I think that loses our credibility as educators when we are so behind. If we're like, now we step in and tell them, we're like, well, they're like, no, that ship has sailed. They're thinking about inclusivity as age is a big one. So some areas on that is, skipped ahead there. For the younger grades, I mean, they love their books, although I've read teenagers' books and sometimes they like to hear too. But this is the librarian in me, that is me doing a story time there. But that story time format is used all over the place because it works, because kids love stories, because it's a breakup between the story and the activity. It's got visual learning, it's got movement, it's got all of it combined that is really great for early learning. So I recommend Storytime format because it's a tried and tested format. So I have a book list I'll share, adding some, I think I have it in this one. If I don't, I'll share it with you. Book lists using picture symbols to kind of like help with our transitions or reminding them of things. But for the youngest kids, we've done songs, we'll do little activities with them, and we talk about asking permission because they often stumble upon it. Being nice to our device. Let's not throw this thing. Let's be careful about the chargers. You have to think a lot of the safety issues with our pre-K and younger kids because, yeah, those screens can really hurt them. The chargers can cause issues. Then basics effect versus fiction, public versus private. These are some things that we've emphasized with the kids. So if you have anything that you want to share of your tips for teaching younger ages, this is kind of an area that we need more people working in. I'm seeing more requests from it that come in, more teachers asking for it. We're creating an ebook that we'll put out later this year for K through 2 if you follow Digital Responsibility. But definitely we need more of this work because it's happening at younger ages. On abilities, so age, I mentioned what I talk about abilities, just like policy doesn't necessarily work one size fits all. So digital citizenship doesn't work as well. I mentioned earlier how special educators are not necessarily included as well. If there are individuals with maybe mental illness, they can be maybe more influenced by malicious actors online. So I've worked at some state mental hospitals and some special ed classrooms there, and if it's a struggle. And so there's this term, I think, cognitive inflexibility that I read it somewhere, but it kind of stuck with me. I thought it was a good descriptor. Autism, ADHD, some of these abilities that struggle with executive functioning, right? We adults forget what that's like because this is developed up in the front. But our kids that part of their brain is still developing. And for some kids, it's even harder to make those plans, to make those goals, to slow down, to think what's real, what's fake with how their brains work. So adapting on a general term, this can fit up a few different abilities, is cognitive inflexibility. It's how we view the world. Can we transition? Can we adapt? Because if we're trying to prepare our young people to be digital citizenship and to be digital literate, they need to be able to switch and adapt and transition quickly. There's often new apps that you have to learn. There's a lot of temptation up there with all the tabs, all the notifications, all of it. So someone who has ADHD will struggle to maybe stay on task, easily distracted. So adapting for that. Making sure that they're aware of transitions and changing, have alternative means of assessments, having a lot of checklists and visual task boards. This is a book that we use with elementary kids that we try to work on some goal settings. But I find that when I would go into like the hospital to teach, I try to put an agenda on the board, be very clear what's coming up, give them a book so they knew what the lessons and everything that was coming up to try to help a little bit. It's hard though. Adults struggle with this as well. But for those that have sometimes this cognitive inflexibility, this struggle with transition, and kind of like being able to adapt, technology can be difficult, can be hard. And then technology can then be used as a coping mechanism, which is not inherently wrong unless it's overused as a coping mechanism. So another thing when you're working with those kids is redirecting the behavior. So they can use other ways to cope or deal with those emotions. Some other these are my experiences. I am not a special educator, but I've worked in a lot of classrooms over the years, is sensory items, keeping the lessons moving. I have a little poll here if you want to share. I'll close this poll, and I have another one. I'm just kind of curious if you have a favorite fidget toy as well. I went through a few different fidget toys over the years. I have like a box that I'll bring in. I'll have my card and my supplies and my box. And I had fidget spinners, but I'm not doing that again because they get thrown across the room and broken and turn into weapons. So fidget spinners are not my favorite toy, but I found some of the kids like the bands that move. I've done those before. Sometimes just squishy things, silly putty, but I'm curious if you have a favorite type of fidget toy. For me, I like the little manipulatives there. I have a few of the little squares that have the buttons on it that they can play with. but I bring the box with me, and I bring this to all classrooms. I don't just bring this to special ed classrooms that they can fidget if they need to, but I have to be careful about it of how, because I've had kids fight over the things before. I have to be really deliberate and about how it's shared, and if it comes back, and I do not put fidget spinners in there anymore. but if it helps with their ability to self-regulate, to cope. This is you have an unfamiliar person walking in on an unfamiliar topic can cause anxiety, and so having something that they can focus on helps. The fidget, the book, The Place to Draw is a good one, and that's usually my go-to, is a lot of drawing and coloring books. I've used those as incentives. I bought the adult coloring books, like with the really nice ones, and I'll do that as incentives too for some of the older kids to participate in lessons. So other tips, I'd love to hear from you of what your tips are for teaching the neurodiverse. This is an area I think we're all learning about, like what does this look like? How does it manifest? How can we adapt? And this is something that's going on in all subjects, not just digital citizenship. But since digital citizenship covers so many ages and so many subjects, having this conversation, these adaptations is especially important. So we started with policy, and I know I've talked fast, but we started with policy, and then we've kind of narrowed down into practice. And you can have a policy that says, hey, we're going to be inclusive here. If you look behind me, you'll find that ISTE did commit some of the standards here, and they have inclusivity. Great, I love it. But inclusivity doesn't mean anything if you don't actually practice it, if you don't actually make the lessons more inclusive, you don't actually have the sensory activities, you don't actually have the assessments and how it looks like. It doesn't mean anything if it's just words on this point. So my experience is working with these different individuals with different abilities. These are topics that we focus on. These are things that we do, but inclusivity is not just a word, it's a practice. So involving the community, getting their ideas of the practice, especially our classroom level teachers, the ones on the ground, they're the ones that will tell you what sometimes works and what sometimes doesn't, and that should help hopefully inform our policies. So I'm glad to have you today. I'll send out the certificate, as I mentioned before, but I can share some other details. I mentioned the fidget book in this. Happy to share that out with you as well and keep the conversation going. So appreciate having you here. Here's some references. Please check, these are that Bowman and Deal that I referenced as well. And check out the website on deepeningdigitalcitizenship.org. We also have a lot more information on this with our Responsible Educator Certificate program. We can provide PD and licensure hours in a few different states. But I appreciate you having me here. Happy New Year, and let's all work to be more inclusive this year. So thank you.